They said my 50-year-old oak was a threat to the neighborhood. One vote and it was sentenced to be cut down. But as I fought to save it, I uncovered something they never expected. Our HOA president had built an entire pool without a single permit. And that wasn't even the worst of it. This tree stood in my backyard for longer than I've been alive. A massive oak, its branches wide and welcoming, its trunk weathered but solid. My grandfather planted it in 1973, when the neighborhood was still new. The roads weren't even paved yet. He planted it with his own hands, a symbol of putting down roots, literally and figuratively. It became a part of our family. Photos, memories, lazy Sunday afternoons under its shade, it was in everything. I learned to climb on its branches. I read books up there during high school summers, and every fall I raked leaves with my dad and cursed it just enough to balance the love. But I never thought anyone would try to take it away. A few months ago, that's exactly what happened. It started with a white envelope in my mailbox. Nothing fancy, just a printed HOA letter. At first, I thought it was another reminder about trash can placement or lawn height. But this one had a bold subject line. Upcoming vote concerning overgrown vegetation, Lot 46. I live on Lot 46. It caught me off guard. The rest of the letter was full of vague language about sidewalk safety, underground pipe concerns, and community aesthetics. The kicker? It ended with a notice that the HOA would vote next Tuesday on whether or not to approve the removal of the tree. My tree. No one called. No one knocked on my door. Just a letter and a scheduled vote. Like it was nothing. I showed up to the HOA meeting early. I even wore a button-down shirt to seem extra reasonable. The room smelled like bad coffee and decades of passive-aggressive tension. About 20 people were there. Some I knew, most I didn't. Everyone flipped through their printed agendas while whispering about lawn maintenance or pet noise complaints. When they got to my tree, the tone changed. It was introduced as Item Number 7, Removal of Dangerous Vegetation on Lot 46. Dangerous? That tree has withstood windstorms, blizzards, and a teenager slamming a bike into it at full speed, and that teenager was me. The HOA president, Tom Rutherford, stood up to read the report. He claimed the roots were damaging public property, specifically, a crack on the sidewalk out front and a concern about nearby sewer lines. He mentioned potential liabilities and community responsibility. A lot of words that sounded official but said very little. Then someone actually said, "We've been needing to deal with that tree for years." It felt like a punch in the gut. Here's the reality. Yes, there's a crack in the sidewalk. A small one. One of the roots is slightly pushing against the concrete slab. Not lifting it. Not splitting it. Just nudging. I had a certified arborist inspect it. His report said there was no urgent threat, no root rot, and no structural danger. I brought copies of that report to the meeting. I also offered to pay for a simple sidewalk repair. It's been done in other parts of the neighborhood with no fuss. One grind and fill and it's done. No need to cut down a half-century-old tree that's rooted on private land. When I brought this up, the room went quiet. Not because they were considering it, but because they didn't care. Tom gave me a tight-lipped smile and thanked me for my input. Then he asked if anyone else had comments. A few muttered things about tree debris in the street. One person said they were concerned it might fall one day. Another claimed it blocked too much sunlight in the morning. That's when I realized they'd already made up their minds. The vote passed 11-5. I sat there, still holding the arborist's report in my hand. 11 people had just decided that something living and beautiful, something that belonged to me, had to be destroyed because it was slightly inconvenient to a few others. I walked home in silence. That tree greeted me like it always did, casting shade over the garden bed I'd built with my wife. The wind moved through its branches gently, like it didn't even know its fate had been sealed by a roomful of folding chairs and lukewarm coffee. But I wasn't ready to let go. I started digging through records. Not out of spite, at least, not at first. I just wanted to understand how the HOA had this much power. What else had they voted on? Who made these decisions? That's when something odd popped up. In the HOA's project approvals and permit logs, one major item was missing: Tom Rutherford's pool. He'd installed it 3 years ago. It was massive, half his backyard converted into a blue oasis, complete with stonework, a slide, and underwater lighting. I remembered because the construction had been loud, and it dragged on for months. But according to public records, there was no permit filed with the county. Not for the pool. Not for any plumbing reroutes. Not for drainage or fencing. Nothing. I checked twice. Then I checked again. Still nothing. So let me get this straight. My 50-year-old oak tree had to come down because of a sidewalk crack, but the HOA president could install an entire swimming pool without a single permit? That didn't sit right with me. Not even close. And that's where things started to shift. Because if Tom thought he could quietly vote my tree into a wood chipper, I was about to show him what happens when someone digs deep enough into the dirt. But that's just the beginning. I couldn't let it go. Not after the vote. Not after the way they dismissed me like I was some stubborn weed in the middle of their freshly mowed lawn. I kept picturing them raising their hands, one after the other, sealing the fate of something that had stood longer than most of them had even lived here. And the more I thought about it, the more one thing stuck in my mind: that pool. Everyone in the neighborhood had watched Tom build it. Not because we were nosy, well, maybe a little, but because it was loud and impossible to ignore. The trucks, the concrete mixers, the constant beeping at 7 a.m. I remember when he first filled it. He threw a party. Half the HOA board was there, sipping drinks poolside while the rest of us listened from behind closed windows. At the time, I didn't care. People build pools. It wasn't a big deal. But now, knowing that the tree was being targeted under the excuse of property compliance, it made me curious. I decided to check the county's online permit portal. I typed in Tom's address. Nothing came up. No pool permit. No drainage adjustment. No plumbing alteration. Zilch. I figured maybe it was a glitch, so I called the county records office. The clerk was helpful, if a bit bored. She double-checked. Still nothing. Are you sure the pool's even real? She joked. Oh, it was real. I asked her what the consequences were for a project like that being built without proper permit. She rattled off a list. Fines, forced removal, and in some cases, even lawsuits from the HOA if the unapproved construction damaged community property or violated zoning laws. That's when it clicked. Tom hadn't just been unfair. He was possibly violating the same bylaws he used to go after my tree. Now, I could have gone straight to the board, filed a formal complaint, waited for someone to process paperwork and maybe, just maybe, do something about it 6 months later. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about fairness. And something told me this rabbit hole went deeper. I took a day off work and visited the records office in person. Real brick-and-mortar place with dusty files and fluorescent lights. I asked to see all filed permits for the HOA board members over the last 5 years. It took some digging, but eventually, I got a short stack of papers. Most board members had basic filings: paint jobs, small additions, patio work. Tom's file was suspiciously thin. Not only was the pool missing, but there was no mention of the additional guest house he'd built last summer. Not even the new perimeter fence. According to county records, Tom's house hadn't had a permit filed since 2017 for a garage door replacement. Either he had the cleanest construction record in suburbia, or he was bypassing the rules completely. That night, I sent an anonymous tip to the county code enforcement office. I included photos of the pool, construction dates, and the absence of matching permit record. I also sent a copy to the HOA's Legal Oversight Committee, not as a formal complaint, just as information to be aware of. 3 days later, everything started unraveling. First, I noticed a white truck parked outside Tom's house during the day. Then a county inspector showed up. They spent an hour walking around his yard, measuring things, taking notes, snapping photos. I wasn't spying, but you don't exactly miss a clipboard-wielding stranger poking around your neighbor's luxury pool. That evening, Tom posted a message to the HOA message board, something about an unfair accusation, an administrative misunderstanding, and a malicious neighbor trying to stir up drama. He didn't mention me by name, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew I had reason to be angry. But the message didn't land the way he wanted. A few neighbors started whispering. Mrs. Alvarez, who lives across the street, emailed me privately. She said Tom had rejected her home addition 2 years ago for being too close to the fence line, yet here he was, building unapproved structures. Another neighbor chimed in that he'd been fined for leaving his garbage cans out too long, while Tom's hot tub had been craned in on a Sunday with no notice. People were starting to notice the double standard. And then came the bombshell. County enforcement sent Tom a cease and desist order. He was instructed to halt all backyard construction activity immediately and appear for a compliance hearing in 2 weeks. If he couldn't provide retroactive permits and approved inspections, he could face thousands in fines, or worse, be ordered to dismantle the pool entirely. Suddenly, the tone of the neighborhood changed. Tom stopped waving when he passed people on the street. His once daily HOA bulletins turned into brief, vague updates. I heard through the grapevine he was consulting a lawyer. I didn't gloat. Honestly, it wasn't satisfying in the way I thought it might be. I wasn't trying to destroy him, I just wanted to protect something that mattered to me. Something that had been here long before any HOA meeting ever existed. But there was still the tree. Despite everything going on with Tom, the removal was still scheduled. I had 2 weeks before the contracted landscaping crew was set to arrive. They didn't care about politics, they'd been paid to do a job. So I made one last move. I filed for an injunction with the County Land Use Board. I presented the arborist report again, highlighted the inconsistencies in how the HOA enforced its own rules, and attached the cease and desist order against Tom. To my surprise, the board took notice. They scheduled an emergency hearing, something they rarely do. I showed up with everything: the timeline, the photos, the records. I even brought a neighbor who spoke in support of the tree, saying it was part of the character of the block. They agreed to pause the removal. Temporarily. That moment felt like air returning to my lungs. The tree still stood. For now. But I knew this wasn't over. Tom wasn't going to let this go quietly. And as much as he was dealing with his own problems, the real battle was just beginning. What I didn't know was that in trying to protect one tree, I was about to uncover something even bigger than missing permits. Something that might change how HOAs operate in our neighborhood forever. The injunction bought me time, but it didn't guarantee anything. The tree was safe for now. But Tom wasn't done. Even as the county threatened fines over his unpermitted pool, he was still trying to frame me as a disruptive neighbor. HOA board emails started circulating. I heard through a friend that Tom was pushing a new vote, this time to change the bylaws, making it easier to remove problematic vegetation, even without majority approval. He was rewriting the rules mid-game. So, I kept digging. At this point, it wasn't just about my oak tree. I wanted to know what gave Tom and a few board members the nerve to twist community policies however they liked, while expecting everyone else to follow every dotted line. That's when I found something buried in the HOA's financial records. Every member receives a basic summary, but I requested a full, itemized breakdown. According to HOA law in our state, I had a legal right to see how our dues were being spent. Most of it was boring: landscaping fees, pest control, newsletter printing. But then, nestled in the quarter from 2 years ago, was a line item marked Community Enhancement Project. Phase 1, with an expense of $8,400. I'd never heard of any enhancement project. Neither had any of my neighbors. When I checked the vendor name, things got interesting. It was a contracting company, Redwell Outdoor Designs, and it just so happened to be the same one Tom used for his pool. In fact, the company had done no other public work for the HOA before or after that date. I looked up their filings. Tom's brother-in-law was listed as the business owner. This wasn't just about unfiled permits anymore. It was starting to look a lot like misuse of HOA funds. I brought the findings to the next board meeting. It was tense from the moment I walked in. Tom sat with his arms crossed, already on the defensive. But when I laid out the records, permit violations, financial discrepancies, unreported conflicts of interest, the room shifted. Other board members who'd previously stayed quiet started asking questions. Why didn't we vote on this project? Where was the community approval? Why was this paid from shared funds? Tom tried to brush it off as a mistake in record keeping. But no one was buying it. 2 days later, a special meeting was announced. A motion to suspend Tom from his duties pending an internal investigation. It passed unanimously. With Tom temporarily out of power, the board revisited the vote on my tree. This time, the room felt different. Neighbors who'd stayed silent before now spoke up in support. One woman shared how her kids learned to ride bikes under the tree's shade. Another man admitted he'd voted against it before just to avoid conflict, but regretted it. The new vote came down 10-2, in favor of preserving the tree. That was it. Months of stress, legal letters, frantic digging through public record. All of it came to a quiet, powerful end in that moment. My tree was safe. But the story didn't end there. The county moved forward with their case against Tom. After several weeks of hearings, he was fined over $25,000 in code violations. He tried to claim ignorance, but with emails, photos, and a full paper trail, it was clear. He knew exactly what he was doing. The county ordered retroactive permit applications, inspections, and compliance updates, or face removal of the pool entirely. The HOA's internal audit revealed more than just the pool incident. There were several other questionable expenses, most tied to vendors connected to Tom's family or friends. The board launched a full transparency policy, forcing all future contracts to go through open bidding. And Tom? He resigned. Quietly. No grand speech. No apology. Just a notice posted to the bulletin board outside the clubhouse, ending with, "I wish the community the best." No one clapped. I didn't want revenge. All I wanted was fairness. And in the end, I think that's what we got. A little justice. A little clarity. And a lot more awareness of how power can be abused, even in the most ordinary of places. Now I still sit beneath that tree on the weekends. Still rake up the leaves every fall. It stands a little taller now, at least in my eyes. Not just because we saved it, but because of what it represents. That even when the system feels stacked against you, digging deep and standing your ground can make a difference. And just like roots under the surface, truth doesn't stay buried forever.